Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Muad'dib.
This journey really started for me on the day of 9/11. I had an American bishop come over to visit me in Ireland, which is where I've been living for the last 12 years. And the night before 9/11, we were discussing the American economy and what a state it was in. And he was in his 80s, and he said to me, when the economy is in this condition, they need a war. Okay? And then the very next day, we went to Dublin, and we were catching the ferry across to Holyhead to go to Glastonbury, which is where, most of you probably don't know, but that's where Jesus was, and where he grew up between the ages of 3 and 12 when he was in the temple in Jerusalem, and then from the age of 12 until he started his mission at the age of around 33 in Palestine. So we were sitting in the ferry port in Dublin, and there was a large screen television hanging from the ceiling so that everybody could see it, nobody could have their view blocked. And he'd just been talking about them needing a war the night before. And we watched 9/11 happen on the screen. And then we got on the ferry, and again they had the large screen televisions. And so we watched it, and we watched it, as you probably did, we watched it repeated over and over, showing the planes hitting the tower. And the first time that we saw it, he looked at me and I looked at him, and he said to me, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" So I said, "I think so, yeah. So what are you thinking?" And we both said at the same time, that was a controlled demolition. Which of course we now know for a fact that it was, but it was obvious to both of us. And the fact that he said the night before that they needed a war was absolutely amazing timing. And so over the following years, I researched, like possibly most of you did, looking on the internet at all the different evidence that actually backed up what we knew intuitively that day. Had happened, that the buildings were brought down by controlled demolition. And then on the 7th of July 2005, I was at home and the phone rang, and it was a friend of mine who lives in London, and he phoned up and said, "Do you know what's happening in London?" And I said, no, what's going off? So he said, well, there's been some explosions on some tube trains, and it's all over the news, on the television, and you ought to turn on the TV and have a look. So that's what I did. And then, because the different television news stations, they all have their own reporters, and they are in different locations, and they're meeting different people, and they're seeing different things. The only way you can get an overall picture of what's really going off is by flipping the channels and trying to get as much different information from different newscasters, journalists as you can. So that's what I did. And later on that day, when I saw Peter Power come on the television, that confirmed everything that I already believed, that it was another false flag. It was obvious. So for 2 years after that, I and some friends investigated 7/7 and looked at all of the evidence. One of the pieces of evidence that you're probably aware of was found by James about the train times, about the fact that the train that the government said that the 4 alleged bombers caught was actually cancelled that day. It didn't run. And the government said they had witnesses on a train that didn't run, of these alleged bombers on a train that didn't run, which was absolutely ludicrous. And so it was impossible. The only train they could have caught was a later train, which would have got them, because James had found the train time, would have got the alleged bombers into London, to London Thameslink station, after the tube trains had already left and blown up. So they couldn't possibly have been on the tube trains. And it appears because Peter Power was running a training exercise that day with exactly the same scenario as what really happened, and that's what they normally do to cover themselves. They run a training exercise and then it goes live, and they do that to cover themselves, that if any of their operatives are caught by police who are not in the loop, who don't know what's going on, then they can just say, oh, I was just taking part in the training exercise, and they would get away with it. And so when we looked into that, the only obvious reason that those 4 Muslims would have been there would have been that they would have been recruited to play the part of pretend suicide bombers with these backpacks on that morning. And then, because they would have been killed on the tube trains if they'd have been on board, because they would have been told exactly where to sit on the tube trains. And so when they got there and they found out that the tube trains they were supposed to catch had all blown up, then they smelled a rat, and they panicked. They didn't know what to do. They weren't from London. They didn't know anybody there. Where could they go? They couldn't go home because they'd been recruited. The authorities knew where they lived, so they were in a panic. So it appears that they went to Canary Wharf, which is in the east end of London, in the Docklands area. And that's where the major media are, the Daily Mirror and the Sun and the big newspapers. To try and tell their story to the newspapers, to try to get the story out because they knew they were supposed to be dead. And their only chance of survival was to get to the papers and thinking that the papers might help them. But we know that the papers are owned by the people who are always involved in these kind of things anyway, like the media and the BBC, who cover all these things up and put out propaganda instead of truth. And it was given out on the morning later on in the morning of 7th July 2005 on the news, and I've been unable to remember which channel I saw it on, because I was flipping channels all the time to try and get all of the news. But James has told me that he thinks he's actually recorded it and got it, so I'm going to make a ripple effect 2. If we can find that footage, I'm going to include that in it. In Ripple Effect 1, I've actually said that I saw it, and lots of other people saw it and heard it, but I couldn't remember. But to actually show it people on the video would, be more convincing, of course. And so, with all the evidence that we had, it must have been around about September of 2007, one of my friends who had been working with me doing research on all of this asked me if because we'd also researched 9/11, he asked me if I'd seen a film called 9/11 Ripple Effect, which is made by an independent television station in America called The Power Hour, a guy called David von Kleist. And I said, no, I haven't seen it, so he gave me a link where I could go and watch it. And unlike some of the other films about 9/11, this was just calm, cool, collected, giving facts, experts' opinions. There was no hype. It was just nicely, calmly done, giving the evidence. And I enjoyed it so much that I said to my friends, I said, has anyone made a film about 7/7? And they said, well, there's a couple of films out there, and there was a film called Mind the Gap with David Shaler, and another one called Ludicrous Diversion. I don't know if any of you have seen them. We don't know who made Ludicrous Diversion, because he's managed to remain, unlike me, he's managed to remain anonymous. And but they're both good films, and they both pick out the inconsistencies in the government story, the anomalies, and the impossibilities of the government story. And I enjoyed them, but they didn't really do the job properly, because it's all like picking out anomalies and showing that the government story is full of holes, but the people need to know what really did happen, so that they can then, tell other people about it and hopefully get together to bring the real perpetrators to justice. So I watched the Mind the Gap and the Ludicrous Diversion, And I said to my friends that I'd enjoyed 9/11 Ripple Effect so much that, you know, somebody needed to make a similar film about 7/7. And so I decided that we ought to do it because we'd done the research, we'd found things that, looking on the internet, that nobody else had found, like the bus routes and different things. And so we set about doing that, and I wrote the script for the film, telling the story of what those who've seen the film will know from the intro, of saying what most likely really did happen that day, because I can't prove it. I can prove the facts that are in it, okay? And I'm 99.9% certain that that is actually what happened. And I think the fact that I got so close to explaining the real story of what happened, that's why that policeman came today, because they're frightened, because they know that when people watch my film, anybody with an open mind who watches it will believe that it's the truth. And I believe that it is the truth. So anyway, the BBC contacted me and they asked me to take part in a TV programme they were making, which some of you may have seen, BBC 2, Conspiracy Files 7/7, which I knew, as soon as they contacted me, I knew it would be a hit piece on me. And so I agreed to take part in the film. In the film they say that I refuse to take part, but they don't say why I refuse to take part. I said I would take part in the film on two conditions. The first condition would be that they would show 7/7 Ripple Effect at primetime television. Okay? Exactly. Yeah. And the second condition was that I would have final editing rights on their programme. So they said, oh well, we're not going to meet your conditions, but we'd like you to take part anyway, and we'd like you to answer this question and that question, and some new evidence has come up, and we'd like your opinion on this and that and the other. I said, I've given you my conditions for taking part in the film, and I'll take part in it if you meet my conditions. They said, no, we can't do that. I said, well, that's the end of this. That's the end of the talk. That's the end of the story. I don't want anything to do with you because I know what you've got in mind. Because I know what these people are like. And so, because I wouldn't take part in that program and recant on what I'd put in the film, they decided that they would take the legal route. And it's sort of like, if you won't play ball with us, we're going to hit you with the bat. Only in this case, the bat was the bar, the legal system. And so they decided to charge me with attempting to pervert the course of justice contrary to public law. Public justice contrary to common law, sorry. And on the 10th of February 2009, I was visited by the Gardaí in Ireland, about 8 of them. I don't know why they needed 8 of them. I don't terribly dangerous, I don't think. I fought extradition to the UK because I'd done absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, I'd done the right thing. And Ireland is still ruled by the Crown through the legal system and through the banks. Yeah, they think they're an Irish republic and that they're independent, but that's only an illusion, because all of the barristers in Ireland and all of the judges are members of the bar, and Elizabeth is the head of the bar. So through that and through the banks, because most of the Irish banks are owned by the English banks, so they actually still rule. And so even though I went through the motions with the court, with the High Court, and then appealed to the Supreme Court, and my barrister stitched me up in the High Court because I gave him my written defence and asked him to use it, and he refused, and then he wouldn't let me. When I realised what was happening, I stood up and said that I wanted to represent myself. The judge said the case is already over, you've been well represented and all the rest of it. And then he ordered my extradition. So I appealed to the Supreme Court. And they really have a sense of humour, because my Supreme Court appeal hearing was scheduled for 11 a.m. on the 11th of November. Okay, you all know what that signifies, do you? For those of you who don't, that was the end of World War I, was declared at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. So I thought, well, maybe these guys are trying to send me a signal that they want to make peace. But they didn't. And so the Supreme Court ordered my extradition, and I was immediately taken into custody, back into custody, and on the 19th of November, I was in Clover Hill prison in Dublin, a remand prison, and they came at 6 o'clock in the morning and got me up and said, you're going to be extradited, and so I got dressed and they took me to the port, and they drove me onto the ferry, the Ulysses, which you may have seen if you've been to Holyhead, and handed me over to 3 plainclothes English policemen from SO15. SO15 is Special Operations 15. They are the anti-terrorist branch. For what I did, what I did had nothing to do with terrorism. I'll explain what I did do and why I did it. But normally what I did, it would be handled by the CID. But this was handled by the anti-terrorist branch. So anyway, they handed me over to these guys, and there is a cell on the boat that they use for this purpose, for extradition. And so I was locked in a holding cell on the boat, and then taken across to Holyhead, and then we drove off the ferry, went to Belgravia police station in London. I spent the night there, then was taken to Westminster Magistrates Court the following morning, and they wouldn't give me bail. They remanded me in custody to Wandsworth Prison. So I went to Wandsworth Prison. The reason that all of that happened was because, this is my opinion, and I can't prove it, but I think the reason that they arrested the 3 young men who were friends of the 4 alleged bombers was because of the success of my film. And they were desperate to convict those 3 young men who couldn't possibly have been guilty, because it's impossible for 3 people to be guilty of helping 4 other people to do something that those 4 other people didn't do. But the government were desperate to convict these 3 so that then they could turn around with their media machine and say to the public, look, these 3 are guilty. So by extension, the original 4 must also have been guilty, and my film is wrong, to try to discredit me and my film. They'd already tried with the BBC Conspiracy File 77 to discredit me, and then that's what they would have done. So when the judge in their trial, thank you, yeah, the judge in the trial of Judge Groves, they call it, in the trial of these 3 young men, he misdirected the jury during jury selection. They normally, for a jury trial, they will have between 25 and 40 people available that morning who are selected, supposedly at random. Some of you may have done jury duty, I don't know, you may not. But the judge said during jury selection to these young men, to these potential jurors, of course you know that Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, Shahzad Tanweer, Jermaine Lindsay and Hasib Hussain carried out these attacks. Well, that's outrageous for a judge to do that, absolutely outrageous, because we have all been led to believe that we have a presumption of innocence in this country.